Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Nona from thealliancelover.com. I have another theatrical romantic video for you today. In the prior video, I looked at the vibes of the romantic, the facial expressions, and did some comparisons. And today we are looking at the very natural expressions, kind of auras that theatrical romantics have and comparing them to other types, especially the romantics, because there is a nuance in their difference. And I want to start off on a seemingly difficult comparison between these two Cleopatras. We have theatrical romantic VIVIEN LEIGH and romantic Liz Taylor. And what I've noticed between these two types in terms of very effortless expression is that the theatrical romantic, even at rest, has a very foxy, almost dangerous look to them, a lot more angular, feline in the eyes, and just the overall facial expression. They're like a wildcat just kind of watching their prey. Whereas with romantics, when they try to create this aura, it takes a lot more effort and it's not as smooth. It's a little bit heavier than when the theatrical romantic does it so easily. A lot of that has to do with your natural facial features. So with VIVIEN LEIGH, she has a much more angular, chiseled, I guess narrow kind of face with the higher cheekbones, the more foxy kind of eye shape, the more pronounced lip. So you can see very easily when she exaggerates that just a little bit by maybe lifting an eyebrow or turning a little bit. Whereas with Liz Taylor, a romantic, she has much more wide, lush, rounder features. So naturally, her expressions kind of want to be open and very round and smoother rather than angular. So she has to try much harder to create these expressions. Going off on that, here are 3 photos. One of it is again a VIVIEN LEIGH, and you can see her full body. And then the other 2 are romantics, Liz Taylor again and GINA LOLOBRIGIDA. So again, let's look at the bodies real quick and then talk about their vibes. So with VIVIEN, she's a lot more narrow, a lot more delicate looking, but a lot longer looking, especially if you look at the upper arm. With Liz, she has a very short limbs. Look at where her elbow is falling. It's falling almost at her rib cage above her waist, whereas with, I would say, VIVIEN's elbow, it's a little bit below her waist. And with GINA, she also has a very short looking arm. Here it's hard to tell because she's at an angle and she's posing, but I would say her upper arm looks a little bit longer than Liz's, but just as short in comparison to VIVIEN LEIGH's much more elongated limbs. These 2 romantics are also much more wide, more lush, and VIVIEN looks a lot more sharp. Now, back to the facial expressions and the vibe. Very, very easy for VIVIEN to kind of shoot lasers out of her eyes. Again, it's the shape of her eyes. Whereas with Liz, it's easier for her to have that kind of dreamy look here. The same applies with GINA, even when she has these crazy eyebrows that are just like Spock going up. She still looks quite dreamy and not as aggressive and sharp as VIVIEN. And next we have VIVIEN next to romantic Marilyn Monroe, and you can really see the difference in their bodies, the width, the roundness, and the face. Marilyn is just a lot more lush, wide, smooth, rounded, short. Even though her face is bigger, relative to her own features, her own body, Marilyn's face looks shorter, and VIVIEN's face looks more narrow and elongated. And with the expression, again, Marilyn just naturally has this very dreamy look in her eyes. And then Vivienne always has that kind of like fire in her eyes, that look of appraisal, like she's just constantly appraising the value in her environment. So it's not super projectile like we saw in the, say, soft naturals in the previous video, but it's not as completely receptive and absorbent as, say, someone with dreamy Marilyn eyes. Totally receptive and very yin, very passive, just taking it all in. And lastly, we have Vivien Leigh and Jean de Castelli. I don't know what her type is. I have seen very few pictures of her, but just going off of expression and kind of their aura, Vivien has a much more sharp, delicate look to her. And then Jean here has a more solid, strong, I would say more yang leaning look to her. She doesn't look as feline in her expression, her face. So just these little nuances that I look at. Okay, so next up we have Mila Kunis, and apparently people think she looks a lot like Sarah Hyland, or at least used to. I can see that with their very similar coloring. Some of their features have the same kind of proportions, the nose, the kind of shorter nose with the nose tip having the same kind of shape, the little kind of chiseled tip here. The distance between their nose and their upper lip is a little bit shorter than average, and then they have both kind of rounder face shapes. And they have big eyes, but they look completely different. Sarah Hyland looks so, I guess, youthful and dreamy and mischievous and playful, whereas Miss Kunis here, Mila, has a very foxy, seductive, kind of sharp eyes. She can really pull off this very seductive, sexy, femme fatale look. I could not see Sarah Hyland really pulling that off, just because the way that her face is shaped. Her eyes are just so bubbly and big and receptive. They also have a bit more of a downturned shape, especially the bottom, and that gives you a very kind of dreamy, childlike look. But Mila, her eyes are more upturned, they're pulled upwards, they're more angular, and it's just a lot easier for her to look seductive. Next, we have Mila next to, I think, two gamines. I know Winona Ryder is a soft gamine. I don't think I've read anything verified about Natalie Portman, but just looking at their faces, Mila, again, you can really see her eyes have that very magnetic but fierce kind of expression, and Natalie just looks a lot more, I would say, neutral, not quite yin, not quite yang, and her face just is a lot more linear in terms of the planes that her features occupy. And then Winona Ryder looking very uncharacteristic in the slow bun, not what I associate her with. I associate her with like her big, huge eyes and short hair. But anyways, she also doesn't have quite that angularity and kind of exaggeration in her features, and just not enough lushness to easily create this expression that Mila does very effortlessly. Next, we have Mila Kunis, and I think soft, natural, Kristen Bell. Look at their expressions. Kristen Bell can do both this very sweet expression and this more like playful, very active expression in her eyes, but just looking at their faces, Mila has so much more roundness and smoothness and lushness to her face, and then Kristen has a lot more of that bluntness to her face, very bluntly shaped features, especially her nose and her mouth and her chin. We will be moving on to SALMA HAYEK and her comparisons, but I just wanted to show these two ladies together. I think they can very easily pull off the same expression, the same look in their eyes, just very, very naturally. So here we have SALMA HAYEK and Drew Barrymore. Drew Barrymore, again, she looks so small and smooth and dreamy and soft and light and hollow and buoyant. And then next to her, SALMA looks a lot more young. She looks more chiseled, more angular. She has just much more, I guess, saturation and contrast in her features, not in just coloring, but just the shaping of her face. I would say that, Drew Barrymore looks extremely angelic, and SALMA HAYEK looks a lot more, I would say, seductive. She would definitely play the bad girl in a role, with Drew Barrymore like never really fitting that role. She's never really cast as super dangerous and seductive. She's always that like bubbly, adorable, very easy to love girl next door. And then SALMA HAYEK is like cast very powerful sex icon. Next, we have SALMA HAYEK and Christina Ricci. Again, Christina Ricci looks smaller. She's a lot more round, more dreamy looking. SALMA HAYEK looks a lot more chiseled and feline than her. Next, we have SALMA HAYEK and Madonna. Madonna's wearing shades, but just looking at her face, and I know Madonna has done a lot to her face, but just the roundness that she still has compared to SALMA HAYEK is just interesting to kind of contemplate. Especially if you imagine Madonna in the 80s, especially with her short hair and her exaggerated eye makeup that just made her eyes look even bigger. She's just super dreamy. And then we have SALMA HAYEK and Beyonce. Yes, Beyonce is taller than SALMA HAYEK, but she is also much rounder and smoother, more hollow looking than SALMA, more dreamy and gentle looking. I would say a little bit more angelic looking than SALMA HAYEK, more innocent looking, especially with this very natural kind of bare-faced look. And then SALMA looks more young, more chiseled, more angular, more aggressive with her sex appeal, more projectile with her magnetism, whereas Beyonce just looks so dreamy and ethereal. And lastly, with the SALMA HAYEK comparisons, we have her and Jada Pinkett Smith. And I think if you look at them together, they look like they're made of the same kind of density. I know that sounds strange, but they look like they occupy the same, I guess, like area in the periodic table. They just look like they have the same amount of, hollowness or density to their bones, depending on where you're looking. They have the same kind of proportion of size and angularity and chiseledness, with that overall smoothness and lushness and opulence to their features. And they have the same kind of vibe, but Jada is a little bit more standoffish looking, in my opinion. She looks a lot less, I guess, warm and friendly than SALMA does. And again, this is all on a spectrum. You have more, feisty looking romantics, and then you have more gentle looking theatrical romantics. Next up, we have Theatrical Romantic and Margaret, and I just wanted to compare her real quick to her co-star Tuesday Weld. Unfortunately, I don't see many pictures of Tuesday Weld, but she seems very cute and adorable, perfect foil for the very seductive, dangerous-looking and Margaret, very in-your-face kind of bombshell sexuality. And then we have adorable, cute girl next door, sweetness personified. Next up, we have Bond girl Jane Seymour. Just looking at her face, you know, she looks like a Bond girl. She looks seductive, a little dangerous. She looks like a femme fatale. One lift of her eyebrow and it's over. She's got that look down pat. It's just very natural for her face to create these expressions. So here next to her co-star, again, she's a Bond girl. She looks very fitting for this role. She looks like she is not as angelic as, say, Olivia Newton-John, who just looks so sweet. I mean, she was Sandy from Grease. And even when she turned into like sexy Sandy at the end, she still looked super innocent. I don't think she could ever play a very alluring, sensual, and effortless, conventional femme fatale, but Jane Seymour does it so easily, even when she's not trying and she's just smiling. She has that kind of foxy look in her eyes, very easily sexy look. Next up, we have Morgan Fairchild. Again, looking at her eyes, that expression, that very kind of upturned, haughty, appraising, but very magnetic expression, the very chiseled, delicate facial features that are still very rounded, the small, petite, delicate body with the chiseled, elongated, soft limbs. So here's a photo of her, I think next to her co-stars. And again, even when she's smiling and it's just a very casual photo, she looks like she's thinking of some master plan or kind of just appraising the camera person. Like, impress me, or am I impressed by you? I don't know. The other ones look a lot more friendly, I would say. A lot more neutral in terms of this very exaggerated magnetism that Morgan has. And in terms of physical characteristics, she definitely looks the most narrow, the most petite, the most chiseled, the most dainty, and the most smooth. Here is a very obvious example of her very yin size and that kind of yang, chiseled, elongated undercurrent. Then we have much larger, wider, broader co-stars here. The contrast is just very, very loud. And now we have Joan Collins and Donna Mills, both theatrical romantics. Even when they're older, they still have that femme fatale vibe. So it doesn't matter how old you are, you will probably have the same kind of sex appeal when you're 90, the same appeal when you're also like 19. So again, they have the same kind of narrowness, chiseled features, and that look in their eyes, those long cat eyes, feline eyes, foxy eyes, whatever you want to call it. The longer nose, the very defined mouth. And it's this high level of definition that makes it so easy for you to notice little changes. Everything is amplified when you have such a chiseled feature. When you have rounder, more lush features and rounder flesh, it takes a lot more to create diagonals and lines and angularity because you're trying to mold roundness into something that's angular. It's hard. So I thought this photo was funny because we have two rather small women, Joan Collins and Donna Mills, and in my opinion, they just look a lot more fierce and dangerous, more like femme fatales than the actual dangerous Naomi Campbell who like will throw a phone at your face. I mean, that's pretty dangerous. So it's just funny that Naomi, who's a supermodel, super tall, very sculptural, looks less in your face than these two ladies. So again, it's just all about the shaping your bones, especially your eyes. Naomi looks rounder, less chiseled in terms of like angular chiseling. She looks more lush in the cheekbones, more rounded in the nose and the eyes and the mouth. So that, I think that's why. And here we have Joan Collins next to Linda Evans, who I believe is a flamboyant natural. And you can really see the difference in their facial shape. Linda Evans has a lot more of that square look to her face, broader, more square, definitely not as delicately chiseled as Joan. Here we have a quick photo of HEDY LAMARR, Judy Garland, who's a soft gamine, and Lana Turner, who is apparently a dramatic, even though she is only, I think, 5'3" or 5'4", if I'm not mistaken. Could be wrong though. Anyways, HEDY is the tallest of the bunch, so sometimes you can't just look at height and decide based off height. You have to look at the whole body and the whole expression. But anyways, again, she has that delicate chiseling to her face. I think she looks the dreamiest of all of the theatrical romantics that we've looked at today, but she still doesn't look as widely dreamy and romantic as, say, Marilyn Monroe. Here we have Judy Garland, who looks so youthful, almost childlike, with her forehead, her eyes not super round and dreamy, but very childlike, and her face, which has a nice mix of yin and yang to it. Nice width, and that's why she looks so youthful. A wider mouth, in my opinion, but not as chiseled, soft. And then we have Lana Turner, who is more, I would say, sculptural in her face than all of them. Her cheekbones kind of draw and round upwards. She has more of that width in her eyes in both placement and shape, but they're not upturned and angular. They're more linear in shape. And it's just interesting to contemplate the differences and kind of guess what their personas are like in action and in real life, just based on one photo. So I just wanted to end this video on this little collage of these women, the femme fatales of the body types. I think it's very, very palpable. Their sex appeal, it's very in your face, feisty, fierce, and magnetic, kind of predatorial in a way, like a cat. And I've said feline so many times because I can't think of a better way to describe their appeal. They're like a small, limber jungle cat, like waiting to pounce and always watching. So let me know if you're a theatrical romantic, or if you know any theatrical romantics who make these faces. I always love to watch people, especially at parties or out in public, just watching people, and their resting facial expression is so illuminating and it's very entertaining. And if they happen to end up talking to you in a conversation, it's always really interesting to share your observations with them, if you feel so bold. So I'll see you in the next video. Bye.